You know, living as a Christian in the United States in the year 2016 is not always an easy thing to do, is it? When we give our lives to Jesus, when we publicly identify ourselves with Him, when we try to live according to the principles that He's laid out for us here in Scripture, it's not always an easy thing to do. We're going to have all kinds of enemies. We're going to have spiritual enemies, and we're going to have physical enemies as well. And those of you who have been Christians for a while, you know that, don't you? You know that at the very moment that you identify yourself with Jesus, that you're going to have a whole new set of enemies that you never had before in your life. Sometimes even your own family members are going to disown you. They're not going to want to have anything to do with you. There's going to be people who are going to publicly oppose you and because of the beliefs that you hold on to in this world. So being a follower of Jesus Christ is not an easy thing to do. Heck, in our country, you can even lose your job, or you can even be sued by other people for trying to hang on to the principles that you believe in, that you find in Scripture. And when we do that, when we live in the midst of all these enemies, we begin to question, well, how do I respond to all these enemies that come into my life because of the fact that I'm a follower of Jesus? I mean, do I just ignore them? Do I hide from them? Do I retaliate against them? How do I respond to all these enemies? Fortunately for us, as you might expect, since we've been looking here in Psalm 23, we find the answer to that question right here in Psalm 23 in verse 5. We'll look at verse 5 this morning. Here's what David wrote. He wrote, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows." It's really interesting if you've been reading through the Psalm 23, you notice there's kind of an abrupt change when we get to verse 5. The pictures that David is using tend to kind of to change there. I mean, think about it. I don't know about you, but I've never seen sheep around a table eating a meal. Have you? Have you ever seen a sheep drink out of a cup that's overflowing? Probably not. So it's kind of hard to understand. What is David completely changing the metaphor he's using here, or is something else going on? Now in his book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, as you might expect, Philip Keller, who is a shepherd, he says, oh, no. David's not changing things here at all. He says, remember last week we talked about how the shepherd would take his sheep up to these high lands in the summertime. He'd take them through the valleys so they could get up to these high meadows. So he says the shepherds often refer to those high meadows as tablelands. I mean, think about it. Here in the southwest United States, we have these high plateaus that we call what? Mesas, which is a Spanish word for table. And so he says that's really what David's talking about here, is taking up the sheep to these high places, and how the shepherd protects them and prepares meals for them and watches over them and protects them in the midst of all their enemies. And there's a lot of commentators that agree with him, and they kind of take that approach to what's going on here. On the other hand, there's some commentators will say, no, David's using a different metaphor here. He's now looking at the shepherd as being more of a host than a shepherd, as this gracious host who welcomes in people and takes care of them. And I'd suggest to you this morning that it doesn't have to be an either-or kind of thing. I mean, think about it. David, he was a shepherd at one point, wasn't he? But he was also a king at one point, a king who was supposed to host people and be a gracious host to them and prepare a table for them and anoint their head with oil and make sure that their cup overflowed. So I don't think it has to be an either-or thing. And as a matter of fact, I think that we can use both of those things to help us to understand what's going on here. Now, I think with that being said, I think we can get a pretty good idea of what David had in mind here, because we know all throughout his life that David lived in the midst of his enemies, didn't he? He sat at the same table with his enemies. Think about it. When he was younger, when Saul was king, David would go and he would sit there at the table with Saul. And a little later on, Saul turns on him and begins to come after him and try to take his life. I think it was probably that's what David had in mind when he wrote this psalm in Psalm 41, when he said, "Even my close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me." Most of you probably recognize that Luke actually quotes that verse as Jesus eats the Passover meals with his disciples, because there Jesus was saying that I'm fulfilling this verse. He was talking about, in that case, about Judas, the one who had been his friend, who has now become his enemy. Later in life, David's son Absalom turned on him, tried to take over his kingdom by force, and actually tried to hunt David down and kill him. And in 2 Samuel 17, I think we have an incident recorded for us that's particularly relevant to what David writes here in Psalm 23. David was fleeing from Absalom, and he comes to the city of Mahanaim, and there's a bunch of guys there with a bunch of unpronounceable Hebrew names, as you'll see in just a moment, and they prepare a table for David in the presence of his enemies. Here's what it says in 2 Samuel chapter 17, beginning of verse 27. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi the son of Nobash, I'm going to kind of skip a bunch of these names because they're really hard to pronounce. But then you get to this one. Here's one I want you to see. A guy named Barzillai, the Gileadite. It says all these guys, what they did is they brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans and lentils, honey and curds, and sheep and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat. For they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So here's David. He's fleeing from his enemies. He comes into this town, and all these guys, they sit down and they prepare a table for David and his men in the presence of all their enemies. And that must have made a really great impression on David. Because as David was on his deathbed, he began to give some instructions to his son Solomon. And among those instructions were this one that we find in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 7. But deal loyally with the sons of Barzillai. There he is, the Gileadite, the same guy we saw earlier. And let them be among those who eat at your table. For with such royalty they met me when I fled from Absalom your father. So these guys, they had given David such great hospitality in the midst of all his enemies that David told his son Solomon, make sure you take care of them, because they prepared a table for me in the presence of my enemies. But regardless of whether David's continuing the sheep metaphor here, or whether he's kind of changing directions a little bit, the fact is, the lesson is the same in either case. Matter of fact, I think we can draw from both of those pictures to come up with the main idea that David's giving to us here, which is this, that God's path will never lead me where the grace of God will not preserve me. Aren't you glad for that? Aren't you glad that God's path will never lead me to the place where the grace of God will not preserve me? I mean, as David walked on this path of righteousness with his shepherd, the Lord had sometimes taken him on some difficult paths. Sometimes those paths went right between his enemies. But as David looks back on his life, he can say, man, no matter what happened to me, the grace of God was always there. And it was the grace of God that preserved me, and in a lot of cases even prospered him and allowed him to walk through those dark places. In a lot of ways, what we're going to see here this morning in verse 5 really kind of complements, doesn't it, what we learned last week in verse 4 when we talked about how to walk through dark valleys in our lives. But we're going to take a little different approach this morning. So what we're going to see this morning is, how do I let God's grace preserve me in the midst of my enemies? Three things. Number one, I have to have the right expectations. I have to have the right expectations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because we've talked about this over and over again. We've talked about the fact that being a disciple of Jesus doesn't make us immune to problems. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. When we identify ourselves with Jesus, we're going to actually have some new enemies that are going to come into our lives. David understood that. He knew that. I mean, think about it. How much of his life did he spend as a fugitive running from his enemies? So he didn't have this pie in the sky kind of view thinking, wow, just because I belong to God, everything's going to be okay. He understood. That didn't mean God would always defeat his enemies. Sometimes God just preserved him in the midst of all those enemies. But what God did promise is he'd be able to walk through those times. and God would be with him, and God's grace would be with him, and God's grace would be sufficient for whatever he went through. About 1,000 years later, the Apostle Paul learned that same lesson and shared it with those who were reading the letter that he sent out. Remember, Paul, he had this thorn in the flesh. We don't really know what it is. I'm kind of glad that we don't know what it is, because what it does is help us to understand that the principle that we're about to look at applies to whatever we might be going through, whatever enemies we might be facing. So Paul prays. 3 times he prays, God, take this thorn in the flesh away. And then he finally got an answer from God. Probably not the one he was expecting. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we read this. But he said to me, he's speaking of what God told him, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Man, you know, when difficulties come in our life, when we have enemies around us, it's obviously okay to go ahead and pray and ask God to take those things away. Paul did that. But we ought to do that understanding that God won't always do that. He won't always remove those things. Because as we saw last week, remember we saw last week, what's God doing when he takes us through the valleys? He's taking us to a better place. And so sometimes God's going to leave those things there to help us get to the place where he wants us to be. So in the present, we have to have the right expectation. We have to understand that God isn't necessarily going to take away all our problems. He's not necessarily going to take away all our enemies. But there's also a future look here in this passage, almost a prophetic look. I think David's looking ahead here to the time in the future when God's going to take and vindicate him in the presence of all his enemies there. There's a time in the future when God's going to make everything right, when he's going to punish evil and he's going to reward righteousness. And when God does that, and we're going to talk some more about this in Connections today, when God does that, he's going to take his people and he's going to vindicate them in front of all of our enemies. God's going to say, look at these people who stayed faithful to me, and I'm going to prove to you that their faith was not in vain. And those people who have been our enemies while we were here on earth, they're going to know that God is God, and they're going to know that we did the right thing by remaining faithful to him, even when we were in the midst of all these enemies around us. So when we think about the future, we can be encouraged by that, can't we? You see, God's path is never going to lead me where the grace of God will not preserve me. But if we want to make sure that the grace of God preserves us, the first thing we have to do is to have the right expectations. Second thing we have to do is to develop an attitude of gratitude. This morning I brought a glass of water with me, and I want to ask you, is this glass half empty or is it half full? 3/4, yeah. I knew there'd be somebody that would smart aleck out there. I measured it exactly. It's half. No. Okay. So, normally what do? We use that to say, okay, if you say it's half full, you're an optimist. If you say it's half empty, you're a pessimist. I got to tell you, I don't even think that's the right question to ask about this glass. You know why? Because I brought a whole gallon of water with me. And regardless of whether this is half empty or half full, I can fill it all the way to the brim with God's grace. Not only that, you know what I could do? Is I can actually fill it till it overflows. Hopefully some of it got in there. And that's what David said that God's grace did for him. In the Middle East in David's day, it was custom that when somebody would come into your home and you were a host, if you really wanted to show them gracious hospitality, you didn't just take their wine glass and fill it to the very top. They would actually fill it so it overflowed like that out onto the floor. And the idea was that when they did that, they were saying, man, I'm going to do everything I can to be a gracious host for you. Said, that's where the saying, my cup overflows, comes from. Because David understood that he had all of this grace of God that was more than sufficient to fill up his cup to overflowing. Any of you ever listened to Dave Ramsey, the financial guy, the Christian financial guy? And on his radio show, when somebody calls in and asks him how he's doing, he has this catchphrase he uses all the time. Anyone know what that is? Yeah, better than I deserve. I think that's probably the modern day equivalent of my cup overflows in a lot of ways. Because we get from God better than anything that we deserve. David also says here that God anoints his head with oil. And we don't have time to go into that. I think it's another picture of what a gracious host would do. Remember, they didn't have air-conditioned cars that they rode in back then. They'd be on these dusty roads, and they'd be walking. They'd get to the host's house, and they had this dust all over them. That's why the whole idea of washing feet was common. But another thing they would do is they would take oil and they would anoint the head of their guests. It was kind of a soothing kind of thing. Since they didn't have air conditioning and things like that, it would be a way to soothe their host. So it's, again, a picture of him being this gracious host. Now think about this. When David wrote these words, when he writes about God preparing a table for him in the presence of his enemies and anointing his head with oil and his cup overflowing, David's not in a great position in life. He's surrounded by his enemies. He's going through valleys. And yet he can write these words anyway. Because he didn't care whether the glass was half empty or half full. He just knew that the grace of his Savior, the grace of his shepherd was enough to keep it filled up and to just keep it overflowing no matter what he went through. And David learned to be grateful for that grace in his life, didn't he? David knew he didn't deserve it. David knew he was an adulterer. David knew he was a murderer. David knew that he disobeyed God, direct orders from God in several different times. And he knew that he didn't deserve all that, and yet God poured it into his life anyway. And so what does David do? He turns around. He's grateful for that. And having that attitude of gratitude meant that he passed that on then to Barzillai and others who had been gracious to him, who had been the instruments of God's grace in his life. And once again, the Apostle Paul, about 1,000 years later, after he'd experienced God's grace with this thorn in the flesh, whatever it was, wrote these words. It said this: "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in some circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." Is that what he wrote? No. Give thanks in some, give thanks in all circumstances. Didn't say give thanks for the circumstances. That would be different, wouldn't it? But that we can give thanks in all circumstances because we know that the grace of God is not only going to protect us and take us through those times, but sometimes even going to prosper us as we go through those times. So regardless of whether your glass is half empty or half full, you need to develop this attitude of gratitude. God's path will never lead me where the grace of God will not protect me. Third thing is I have to do if I want to make sure that God's grace protects me is to spend my time feasting with Jesus, not fighting my foes. This is probably the hardest one of all of them, to be real honest. Think about this. If you want to go to one of the finest restaurants in Tucson, which would be the best table to get? Now that probably depends on which restaurant it is and what you consider to be your favorite. I know for Steve and Jen, who worked at Anthony's at one time, which is now Vivace, that restaurant was known for its great views, among any other things. So if you go to that restaurant, what table do you want? One that gives you the best views of the city. If you want to go to the Melting Pot for a special occasion, the best tables are these. They have these curtain booths in the back where you can go and have a private little dinner and not be bothered by anyone else. So that's probably the best ones there. If you're to go to Mr. On's, the best tables are the tap-on tables where you sit at the table and the chef not only cooks you a meal but puts on a show for you, right? But for a lot of places, if you were to go to the best restaurants around the world, you know where the best table is? It's actually in the kitchen. If you can be privileged enough to actually be in the kitchen with the chef, to watch them cook, and if you're really fortunate, to maybe even be able to participate in the cooking of your meal, that would be the prime table. And when I think about what God does for us this morning, that's what He does for us. He wants us spiritually to be in the kitchen with Him. He wants us there so He can talk with us as He's preparing that meal. So He can show us how He wants us to live our lives. So that if we're really fortunate that we even get to join in and participate with Him in the work that He's doing in our lives, in the lives of other people. So He wants us to enjoy that time. But unfortunately, what do? We live in this microwave, fast food world where we just want to grab our meal in the car and run with it and eat it on the way and not really enjoy the presence of the chef. And a lot of us have gotten into that same habit with God. We're so distracted by all the other things around us that we just don't take time to really invest time with Him, just enjoy time with Him. And you know what is even worse? When it comes to dealing with our foes, what do? We try to cook up our own recipes. Say, I'll figure out how to deal with my enemies. I'll figure out how to get back at them and retaliate at them. And while those things might work sometimes for a little bit, they ultimately really don't solve anything. That's why, look at this psalm. David's attention here is where? It's all on God. It's all on His shepherd. It's all on the host. He just says, I'm in the presence of my enemies, but he doesn't waste any of his time fighting back against his enemies. He spends all his time fellowshipping with the shepherd, fellowshipping with the gracious host that he has here. He just enjoys that grace that God's pouring out into his life. And I got to tell you, this is an area where I really struggle in my life. I'll be honest, and I think maybe some of the rest of you do too. As I began to work on the message this week, God began to bring into my mind all these ways in my life that I waste time fighting with my foes instead of feasting with Jesus. And I know none of you have a problem with it. But let me just share with you a couple things that God brought to mind, maybe just in case it might jog your memory a little bit as well. Maybe I shouldn't even be on Facebook anymore because I get really ticked at some of the things that people put on there. Do you, if you're on there? And my first reaction is I start figuring out, how am I going to get back at this? How am I going to respond to this? And I waste so much time doing that. For a lot of my life, I've placed way too much faith in the ability of our political system to take care of the problems around us. For a long time in my life, I was a political junkie. I mean, even 4 or 5 years ago, I'd have probably watched all the convention this week and next week and all. I didn't watch a minute of it because I'm not going to waste my time doing that anymore. Because the problems that we face as a country, they're not going to be solved by any person, any political party. They're only going to be solved by turning our nation back to Jesus. So I'm going to spend my time praying for our country instead of trying to depend on the political system. Now, let me be clear again, like I've said before. I'm not saying that we shouldn't vote. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be good citizens. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to elect godly people into office and that we shouldn't respectfully share our opinions with our public officials. Those are all fine. But I'm just not going to waste a whole lot of time doing those things when I need to be about feasting with Jesus and spending time with Him, because He's the only one that's going to fix those things in the long run. And I'm getting a little better at this, but I still have a tendency to hold grudges against people who hurt me. And even worse, against people who hurt my wife. I'm pretty protective of her because I love her. And sometimes I don't do a very good job of letting go, and I spend way too much time figuring out how I'm going to get back or retaliate at them. That's not feasting with Jesus. See, God's path will never lead me where the grace of God will not preserve me. But if I want God's grace to preserve me, then I have to spend my time feasting with Jesus and not fighting with my foes. At the very beginning of this message, I posed the question to all of us. How do we respond when the enemies of God and our own personal enemies attack us? How do we respond to that? And my prayer is that after this message this morning, you'll have a much better handle on the answer to that question. While there might be some times where in the short run it's probably good to just kind of get out of the way of them, the long-term answer isn't to ignore them. It's not to hide from them. Isolation is not the answer to that. We're not to ignore them. David didn't do that. He knew he had enemies around him. We're certainly not to retaliate against them. The Bible's pretty clear on that. David understood that here. We're not to fear them. We've seen that over the last couple of weeks. David says what? That he will fear no evil, for God is with him. What we are to do is to trust that God knows what He's doing. And to trust that whatever we're going through, that He's going to take His grace and He's going to pour it out into our lives until it's overflowing. And that that's going to be sufficient for whatever else comes into our lives. And then knowing that one day God's going to He's going to make all those things right. We don't need to do it ourselves. So here's what I want to do as we close this morning. I was trying to think, what's a really practical way to apply what we've learned this morning? I'm going to give you a few minutes to do something that we probably don't do in church nearly often enough. I'll give you time to pray for your enemies this morning. That's what Jesus said to do. And I don't know who your enemies are. I'm sure some will probably come to mind as you pray. Maybe it would even help to write their names down just in your bulletin. Use it as a reminder, because I want to encourage you, don't just pray for them now for a couple minutes, but take some time to pray for them this week. I can't think of a more practical way to apply that what we've learned this morning. So right now I'm just going to ask, go ahead and bow your head, close your eyes, and take a few minutes just to pray for those who might be enemies in your life.